You know, the regions are so rich in Italy, and each one has a unique story to tell. And when you start thinking about what am I going to tell you all in 20 minutes, it always ends up getting distilled down to just 2 or 3 places in the region. So we're going to have to cycle back and do them all over again, and not talk about the capital city in the region. And for those of you who've come to a lot of our regional dinners in the past, I'm not going to tell you about the Greek origins of the region, because that's not true here. I'm not even going to talk about the Roman period, because this region really comes to life starting in the Middle Ages. While there were Romans there, it's really the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, and then in the 17th and 18th century, really interesting things happened in the region as well. And then in the post-World War II era, Milan really is the focus of so much of the rebuilding effort. So we're going to do a lot in 20 minutes, and I hope you enjoy learning a little bit about the region. And for those of you, sadly for me, who are in the audience who are from the region, don't be too critical. You know, I love maps, and I love, you know, to show people that even in Italy with the 20 regions, each region has sub-districts within it. And so each one of these sub-districts really could be the source of its own evening. And I'm especially sad that we're not going to talk about Bergamo and Brescia tonight, because those are 2 cities that I really love, and there's a lot to say about them, but we're just going to kind of gloss over them. They'll have to be for our next Lombardia. And then people who've come to these events know that I do like to march through the time. And so this slide, which I found on the internet, so it's not my slide, but it shows beautifully really that this is an area where, while there's archaeological evidence that goes back more than 2 millennia, it's really from kind of the Frankish period through the Napoleonic period to the modern day that this region really tells a rich story. And then you can't talk about Lombardia and Milan without talking about Leonardo's Last Supper. And it's famous the world over. It's an extraordinary painting. And it was in the refectory hall of a monastic complex, so it was meant for a very private group of people. You know, today, obviously, it can be very difficult to even get a ticket to come in and see the Last Supper. And one of the extraordinary things about this was in an area of Milan that was very heavily bombed during World War II. They actually sandbagged the entire building inside and out because they understood how fragile this painting was and how important it was. It actually came through the war in pretty decent shape. The sandbagging system worked. You know, unfortunately, starting in the 1960s, there was incredible water infiltration into this building. And the wall directly behind this painting was just saturated with water constantly, in part because it's a wet, humid climate as opposed to, say, southern Italy, which has a drier climate. And there just seemed to be no way to get the water out of the wall. And so in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of discussions about could the entire painting be taken off the wall and restored and put into a museum. People really understood that that was going to forever change the way you interact with this painting, and the importance of being in that space and understanding that this was, you know, a private space. Because it's a relatively small refectory hall where it is, so the painting is very overwhelming. And there's actually a woman named Pinin Grambilla who died in 2020, and she is the conservator who came up with the system to restore this painting. And for more than 20 years, she painstakingly worked to help dry the wall out, and then literally glued small pieces of the painting back on to their support. And if you Google her name, you'll find fantastic photos of the painstaking work that she did, literally with tools that were the size of, you know, tweezers and like Q-tips. And she was very, very conscious of not wanting to, you know, add to the painting, because, you know, one thing you can do in conservation is painstakingly restore a painting by putting back what you know was there once, but she really wanted to not leave the painting in a ruinous state, but to leave it in a state that you really were only seeing, you know, the hand of Leonardo and his assistants, and perhaps earlier restorations, but she didn't want to add anything to it. So that's why in those upper levels, you still see areas where it looks kind of blotchy, because that's the effect of the salt coming through and marring the painting. But, you know, it's a very beautiful experience, and we really have her to credit for, you know, kind of unlocking the technology that would save the painting.
Can you repeat her name for a second?
Pinin, P-I-N-I-N, Brambilla, B-R-A-M-B-I-L-L-A.
Great.
And then, you know, the centerpiece of Milan is the cathedral. And it's an extraordinary early medieval building. You know, it gets started in the early part of the 14th century. If you go online, it'll probably tell you that it didn't get finished until 1965. That's not quite true, but it did have a long, torturous life in that the work went on long enough that tastes changed. So while the exterior looks the way it was originally designed to, the interior actually just kept taking long enough that people decided on different decorative campaigns. And then during the Napoleonic era, Napoleon actually ordered that the cathedral be finished. And so they did a tremendous amount of work during the Napoleonic period and got most of the bays done. And then in the 19th century, you know, tastes change again, and so they do some more work on the bays. Then, while the cathedral came through the war in decent enough shape, it suffered some war damage. To give you a sense of what happened during World War II in Milan, the US and England bombed Milan 1,200 times. So an enormous number of bombs fell on the city. The cathedral still stood, but there was a certain amount of damage to it. So in the 1950s and 60s, they do the repair work, and they finally, in 65, hold a ceremony to declare Milan Cathedral done. But I want to pay a special attention to the environment immediately around the cathedral, because for anybody who's spent time in Milan, it is a very, very modern city, except for this tight core around the cathedral. And they made a very conscious decision at the end of World War II not to rebuild the city. So about 70% of Milan's buildings were destroyed during the war, and they made a conscious decision to restore a very tight circle immediately around the cathedral to have this historic center, and then basically said, the rest of the city is just going to be modern, and we're going to let development take its course. And so one of the other jewels of Milan is obviously La Scala, which is not necessarily even the most beautiful opera house in Italy, but it is, you know, an extraordinarily old building. It actually was built in the second half of the 18th century, so it goes back quite a bit. On the far left is a 19th century image of the cathedral. The upper right is the interior. You'll be interested to know that until the 1920s, it was still lit by oil lamps and candles. So when you went to La Scala in, say, the late 19th century, you really had a feeling of sitting inside a jewel box, because there would have been about 150 candles and oil lamps lit in order for you to see the stage, and really quite a magical experience. And then this is what it looks like today. It was almost thoroughly destroyed during World War II. So what you visit today in La Scala is very much the essence of what it was meant to be. But as you can even see from those two photos, there's some subtle differences between what it was and what it looks like today. And it's one of the examples of really the incredible artistry of Italian restorers, that immediately after the war, so many of these buildings were rebuilt, but they were rebuilt very much to evoke what they had originally been. Yep.
So a question about the cathedral. I read somewhere, and I don't know if it's, you know, it's like an internet thing, so you never know.
The internet is always true.
That you can actually part of the maintenance of the cathedral, you can, as an individual, like sponsor a gargoyle.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yep.
Not a gargoyle, one of the
One of you owns the gargoyle?
Spires.
yes.
Oh, gosh, that's so great.
Yeah, so they've had a lot of campaigns like that over the years to sponsor different elements of it.
Take a picture.
No, sorry, I didn't actually pay for one of them. I just not the gargoyle.
You know, it's like a doctor's pet.
So, I mean, so, just if you're looking for a New York City example, so if anybody's ever been out to the Panorama at Flushing Meadow, Queens, you can adopt one of the buildings on the Panorama to pay for its restoration in perpetuity. Like, I bought the Astoria pool a number of years ago, and to honor my father, who was born in Astoria. So everybody uses this technique. Very effective. So, and then, if you walked from the cathedral to La Scala, chances are you passed through the Galleria, which goes back to the 19th century. And while there were a lot of these Galleria-type structures in the 19th century, a lot of greenhouses were built with the same technology of cast iron and glass. A lot of them do not remain, but the Galleria in Milan not only exists as a corridor to get between the cathedral and La Scala, but it is a destination unto itself. Many people go there just to walk around or to have a coffee, but it is really, one of the unique features of the streetscape that survived the war, fortunately. And while it's at its most basic level, a mall, it's also really just this sense that Milan in the 19th century was a cutting-edge city, and to have this there really was meaningful. And similarly, the train station dates to the 1930s, and it is a fantastic neoclassical building from the outside, but on the inside really took advantage of the technology of the day. You could build the windows much bigger, because by that point you could fairly easily import plate glass. And then, obviously it's been modernized over the years with escalators, etc. But it really is, even though it's a form of transportation and you run in and out of the train station, not always hanging around it, it is really an engineering marvel. When they built the train station, they built with the idea of growth. So a lot of other train stations that had to struggle with how to add tracks, Milan saw itself as a major city at the time, and so they built a very, very large number of tracks that were unusual in the day. And so this is really a great example of the ingenuity of the people in that era. The original train station would be about a 10-minute walk south of where this building is today. The original train station was built by a French architect. It became obsolete fairly quickly, and when this one was built, it was really built very much to be a centerpiece of Milan. And even in its earliest incarnation, it not only took you to other parts of Italy, but it already was taking you to France, which was seen as a big, important breakthrough for the train station. And then you can't not talk about Milan and talk about this incredible streetscape. So this picture really shows the cathedral, the Galleria, and then the city beyond.
I was going to say that if you visit the Galleria, go to the top and to the Pavarotti restaurant on the left.
Okay. So now we all know what to do on our next trip. I'm very happy about that. But Milan is an extraordinary city today, and while it suffered during the war, and that's to be lamented, Italy really picked itself up. The post-war reconstruction efforts, were throughout the country. When you visit Florence, you would not know how much of that city was also bombed very heavily. And for those of you who came when we had a talk last year, and I said that 80% of the buildings in Rimini were destroyed during the war. So when you go to Italy today, it's not necessarily in your consciousness how heavily affected Italy was by the war, but it was, devastating. And so to see Milan flourishing like this, 60 years later is really quite something. And then, we only have a few minutes together, but I really, would be remiss if I didn't talk about what an extraordinary city it is. So the Po River runs through it, Italy's largest river. So it meant that from an early stage, an early settlement, you could get goods into Milan because the river was a conduit for moving building materials back and forth, for moving agricultural goods. So it's always been a commercially inclined city. Today, it's home to several important universities, Bocconi, Politecnico, and others. So it's a major center of learning and a major center of strategic planning initiatives that come out of many of the graduate student programs. I wish we had more time to talk about, the ways in which Milan has contributed to any number of fields.
Lisa, could
yeah.
I just say one question? Because I think, I'm sorry, I'm Albert Gardini. My family is from, I'm Italian-American, but they're from Parma and also Milano. But you should really look about the fashion of Milano. My daughter lives in Rome over 20 years and she's in fashion, and her father-in-law told me, who brought Jean-Paul Gaultier to Italy, told me always one thing. We were having dinner one time, he said, Alberto, he said that Rome, we are the capitale.
Giusto.
In Milano non c'è niente.
Giusto!
So what are we going to give them? Give them fashion. Never thinking the biggest mistake that Rome ever did, they gave them fashion.
Giusto.
So I hope that sometimes when you think of bella cosa, when you think of Milano, I was on a flight one time with so many people, and they go shopping on October to buy clothes. Milano is fashion. And the stupid Roman people said,
Hey!
It's crazy, but it's so true. And they never thought, just give them a little something. And look at Armani, look at my Piacentina, Le Piacenza, Madonna. But anyhow,
Okay, I love your suit. I'm from Milan. I love your suit.
So I happen to be a big fan of the design industry in Milan, in addition to fashion. So Alessi products, I think, are the most brilliant on the planet.
Yes.
So we'll have to have a whole separate night of the commerce in Milan, I think. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is that what makes cities interesting, like the city we all live in here in New York, is that they're ever changing. There's always some kind of adaptation going on, and Milan has done the same. So on the left is the Fondazione Prada, which is an 18th century distillery, which is mostly 19th century buildings now. But they took it over and they turned it into one of the greatest art destinations that there is. They've been in existence, for about 10 years. They have phenomenal contemporary exhibitions, but they also tackle interesting things. They had an exhibition there last year that was all about the wonders of neuroscience. And so it's not just art, it's, they're really looking at social problems. And I put up this quote from Miuccia Prada because she's very proud of the fact that they've taken on this other element of their work, that it's not just, well, I shouldn't say not just, that in addition to the tremendous fashion force that they are, they've created this incredible destination. For those who are interested, they also have a really interesting blog about all kinds of contemporary issues. They had one last year that was all about sea rise and some of the challenges of coastal erosion. So they've taken on a big footprint, well beyond just seeing themselves as designers. They really see themselves, as part of the world stage, which is great. And then the lower two images are something that maybe few people have visited, but Italy has had a complicated way of trying to describe its 20th century history, and about 11 years ago, they opened up the Showa Memorial in Milan train station. And, it was a shock to a lot of people to learn that there were actually Jews deported from Italy that went to Auschwitz and Birkenwald. And this was a very controversial thing to open this museum. It's a very, very moving experience for people who do take it on. It's actually in the subterranean level of Milan train station. There are 20 known trains that took people to Auschwitz and Birkenwald. They've created a very beautiful memorial with all the names of the people who were deported. And this is not meant to be a maudlin place. They very much want it to be a place for people to learn and gather. They also have a conference center, and they do quite a number of things, not to remind people of the worst of humanity, but to try and say that it's an extraordinary thing that it survived. I mean, it was somewhat rediscovered by accident 20 years ago, and it's one of the only train deportation stations from that era that wasn't destroyed. And it's because it was so far underground and it was unused. So it's not everybody's cup of tea to go and visit such a thing, but it's really quite remarkable that the Italian government and a number of funders really came together to create this memorial. And then, going back to Albert's point about the forward-thinking people of Milan and the kind of incredible creative genius. So Stefano Boeri is actually a favorite architect of mine. He is very, very prolific. He has buildings all over the world. But he's a deep thinker about architecture. It's not just buildings. So he created this incredible Bosco Verticale. It's not that long ago, it's 2014, so just over a decade ago. It's actually been replicated in a number of places by other architects. But the fascinating story is he went to Dubai for a commission and suddenly realized that there he was in the desert, surrounded by high-rise buildings that were built entirely of glass and concrete. And that the heat effect of all of that glass in the desert climate was incredible. So therefore it took a massive amount of air conditioning to make these buildings habitable. And he came back, and he's written a lot about this and been interviewed about it. He came back and he thought about what would reduce that heat effect. And so he created these two towers, and there's another office building connector between the two towers, where the more greenery you could get onto the building, it just automatically kept it cooler. And this is not a glass tower. He really you wanted to have light in your apartment, obviously, but he minimized the amount of exposed glass there would be by having these terraces that are completely planted. And every now and then you'll see competitions where people kind of try to evoke this, and every now and then there's plans for buildings in New York that never happened with this, but this is proof that it actually works. And they've interviewed the people who live in the buildings, and in fact, they're very energy efficient, and they in fact do provide this cooling effect. So he's a brilliant architect, and he's from Milan, anytime there's a chance to see his work, I highly recommend it. We're going to take a quick step back in time, and wanted to talk about a few of the other cities in the region. So Mantova, I have a personal affection for, which is my first job out of college. I worked for the Samuel H. Kress Foundation that was deeply involved in some of the post-war reconstruction projects. And one of them that they took on was the Ducal Palace of Mantova. So, it's just always stuck with me that this was an extraordinarily beautiful place, heavily damaged during the war. And so what you've got on the left is the Ducal Palace. The Castle of San Giorgio is actually in the Ducal Palace. So it gives you a sense that, so if you see the building that's on the lower right, kind of surrounded by a moat, that's this building. Thank you. But it gives you a sense of how castle architecture changed. So in the early Middle Ages, when you built these, they had to be totally fortified because they had to be completely defendable. And so, they look rugged, they look impenetrable, they don't have a lot of windows. The windows that they have are fairly small. Then you get to the Ducal Palace, where the Gonzaga family had a very long, prosperous reign. And you see that, nope, that's not Palazzo Te. You're fired. And you see that one starts to meander a little bit. You've got more open spaces. And then the Palazzo Te is really this incredible expression of mannerism in architecture. So we usually think of mannerism in painting, but when you get to Giulio Romano and Palazzo Te, what you see is this incredible rethinking of it. So the building is actually almost insignificant, but you've got this incredible intersection of courtyards and green space and open space. And so the whole concept of how you were going to inhabit this space is very different. And you can also tell that these are peaceable times because you're not building in this fortification mode anymore. And so, back to my Crest Foundation life. The Camera dei Sposi was the most glorious complex of paintings inside the Ducal Palace of Mantova. And a bomb fell, in fact, in the middle of this room. And so the conservation efforts in the 1950s and 1960s were to try and repair this building as much as possible, but in particular to get this room back in good order. And I mentioned the sandbagging, so that happened all over Italy. This was a phenomenal civilian effort. So they just called upon every able-bodied person to try and sandbag as many of the monuments as possible. And there were incredible photos during the war years of things that look sort of like Klaus Oldenburg sculptures, because they've just surrounded all of these buildings with sandbags. And it's why so much of the art and architecture in Italy did survive. And so this building, while it was very heavily damaged, and while this room was in fact one of the rooms that had bomb damage, in fact, enough of the paintings were intact. So what got lost was a lot of the decorative campaigns around the paintings, but the paintings themselves were in good enough condition to restore them very, very beautifully. And I was able to go for a 50th anniversary of the reopening of the building, and it was, really something to understand just how much of an effort it took to get these back and open to the public. But the interesting thing about Giulio Romano and the Camera dei Sposi is this was an unusual new concept, that you would have these highly decorated, very private rooms, because normally the highly decorated rooms were the public rooms. And so this was a new way to start thinking about space and having a private bedroom be so richly decorated that theoretically few people were going to see. The other thing about these paintings, Giulio Romano was an incredible architect, engineer, artist, and he really introduces in a broad way the concept of trompe-l'oeil. So one of these things about these paintings that you can't quite get in photographs, but when you're there, it feels like a very immersive experience. So some of the paintings that depict things like courtyards and people leaning against columns, you actually feel like you're very much in that space. But the most glorious achievement in this room, and highly unusual for a bedroom, was this creation of almost a cupola-like space in the bedroom. So when you were seated in this room and looked up, you have this incredible sense, and again, it doesn't quite come through in a photo, but it's an incredible trompe-l'oeil experience that you feel the depth. And so even though it's a flat painting, when you look up, you've got this kind of soaring experience. And this was a major, major breakthrough in painting at the time. And then he is also responsible for the Palazzo del Te, which, again, is this incredible rethinking of space. So it's not until the 18th century that you see palaces built in this mode very regularly, of lots of green space and this kind of expansiveness, because it would have been considered so unsafe in earlier times to have these big open expanses for royal families or noble families. And so here you've got this incredible idea of interlocking courtyards and moving through the space. And every room by Giulio Romano in the Palazzo del Te is extraordinary, but probably the two most famous are the Gallery of Horses, which is on the left, and the Room of the Giants on the right. And so he's taken these mythological stories and recreated them in this Hall of Giants. And again, when you're in these rooms, you feel like the giants are falling. You have like this kind of emotional reaction. And he was really the breakthrough artist to start making that connection, because a lot of them before him, you're looking at the paintings, admiring the beauty, taking away the message you're supposed to, but he makes you have like a physical response to being in these rooms. And so, we often talk about the great Italian painters and their breakthroughs, but we often don't realize how far ahead of the pack they were. And then I feel like I gave a lot of time to Milan, and we're going to race through a few other cities. But you also can't talk about this region without talking about Cremona. So I talk about art and architecture and urban planning a lot because that's what I love and it's what I know about. But even I, who know little about music, know that Cremona is an incredible, center. Even today, if you can own, a stringed instrument made by a Cremona artist, you have an extraordinary musical instrument. And if you were to go to the Met and go to their musical instrument collection and see the incredible collection they have, over 500 years of instruments that have been made in Cremona. Just like the art and artists and the architects perfected a craft, in Italy, because of the richness of the different woods that were available and different techniques that they perfected for drying the wood and aging the wood, the musical instruments that are made there have incredible sound, and they really have no parallel even today. And then everybody knows the lake regions, and everybody knows Lake Como. Some people know Lago Maggiore. I have a bizarre affection for Lago di Seo, which somebody once told me was the least interesting of all the lakes. And I always thought that was very mean. But then I got my comeuppance because 10 years after I first went to Lago di Seo, Christo and Jean-Claude did this incredible installation one summer. They're famous for the gates in Central Park and various other things like wrapping the Reichstag in Germany. And they did this incredible installation at Lago di Seo more than a couple of years ago, 10 years ago. And so, you see that this brought throngs of people. It put Lago di Seo on the map. And again, just the way Italy is not afraid sometimes to have these artistic interventions. And the last thing I'll say about the lake region is that, what you've got is this incredible geological area there because of the Alps and because of the way, the geological patterns are. These lakes are, very sizable and very, very beautiful, and each one of them, though, has its own microclimate. And so there are flowers and certain kinds of vegetation that really only grow in this region because you've sort of got the Alps coming down and then these lakes. And so they've remained, even though they're very touristy, they've remained very pristine from an ecological point of view. And then, we've talked a little bit about the fashion industry and the design industry, but this is where Milan really exceeds. The Salone dei Mobili is an incredible annual furniture fair, and we all see the effects. All you have to do is open up the New York Times after the festival every year, and you see what the trends are, and actually, we could walk around Manhattan, and there are innumerable Italian design wares for sale all over, and this really has become an incubator for great ideas. And then we did not leave Fashion Week out.
Yes.
We did leave it for the end, which maybe now I regret. But if you looked at the first half of the 20th century, it was all French designs. If you aspired to be sophisticated, you wanted the couture from Paris. But that really shifted starting in the 1970s, and you begin to see Italian apparel really come to the fore, and all we have to do is walk on Madison Avenue and see every incredible fashion house that is represented there. are actually right on the corner, actually. You can just walk to the corner of 69th Street and there's Dolce & Gabbana. But when you watch any award show, it's, you know, Schiaparelli, Dolce & Gabbana, Domenico Veneziano, it's just, you know, Gucci. It's one fashion house after another. And so Italy and design have really come to the fore. And I am going to turn it over to Jan, because now we're going to talk about our cuisine this evening. And Jan, despite his name, was born in Milan and raised in Piemonte, and so he's going to take us through the last few minutes.